Jane Seymour. Of all the women who died because of Henry VIII, Jane Seymour is the one he actually mourned. And the cruelty of her death was not political or violent, but biological. A body pushed past its limits in service of a king who had waited nearly 30 years for a legitimate male heir. Jane died on October 24, 1537, at Hampton Court Palace, just 12 days after giving birth to the future Edward VI, at approximately 29 years old. Those 12 days were deceptive. Edward's birth on October 12th had been celebrated across England with bonfires and church bells. And for a brief window, it seemed as though Jane had done what Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn could not. But the labor that produced the heir had been catastrophic. Contemporary accounts suggest it lasted approximately 3 nights and 2 days, with the baby believed to have been poorly positioned in the womb, a prolonged and grueling ordeal for a woman with no surgical options and 16th century medicine at her bedside. The cause of Jane's death has been debated by historians ever since. For centuries, the most commonly accepted explanation was puerperal fever, also called childbed fever, a bacterial infection of the uterus that was the single most common killer of new mothers in the early modern period, and would remain so until the discovery of germ theory 300 years later. But historian Alison Weir has proposed an alternative theory, that Jane may have died from food poisoning combined with a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot traveling to the lungs, a complication that can follow difficult labor and would have been entirely invisible to Tudor physicians. A third myth, that Henry ordered surgeons to perform a caesarean section to save the baby at the cost of the mother, is almost certainly false, not only because caesarean sections were not performed on living patients in 16th century England, but because Edward was clearly healthy and the labor, while difficult, was not documented as requiring surgical intervention. What is documented is Henry's grief. The king retreated from public life, withdrawing to Westminster, and keeping himself, in the words of contemporary accounts, close and secret for a period of weeks. The English court was plunged into black mourning. Henry himself wore black for the following 3 months, an unusually prolonged period of royal grief by any standard of the era. Most striking of all is what Henry chose nearly a decade later. When he died in January 1547, he was buried not beside Catherine of Aragon, his first and longest wife, not beside Anne Boleyn, the mother of his eventual successor Elizabeth I, but beside Jane Seymour at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. Of his 6 marriages, 1 produced the heir he needed, and the woman who gave it to him took that secret to her grave at 29, 12 days after the moment that was supposed to be her triumph. Lady Jane Grey. Lady Jane Grey reigned as Queen of England for 9 days, July 10th to July 19th, 1553, making her the shortest reigning monarch in British history, and arguably the one with the least real power during those 9 days at that. She was placed on the throne not by popular will, not by her own ambition, but by her father-in-law John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who saw in the teenage Jane a convenient Protestant alternative to the Catholic Mary, Henry VIII's eldest daughter, who had the stronger legal claim to the crown. Jane herself reportedly wept upon being told she was queen. The country did not rally to her. Within 9 days, the nobility had largely defected to Mary's cause, and Jane was removed from the throne without a battle, imprisoned in the Tower of London alongside her husband Lord Guilford Dudley and her father Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, all of them charged with high treason. Initially, it seemed possible that Mary might show mercy. Jane was, after all, a teenage girl who had been maneuvered into her position by powerful men, but a Protestant rebellion led by Thomas White the Younger in early 1554 ended that possibility. Mary's advisors convinced her that as long as Jane lived, she would remain a focal point for Protestant opposition. The execution was ordered. On the morning of February 12, 1554, Lord Guilford Dudley was led out to Tower Hill and beheaded. Jane reportedly watched his body being carried back past her window on a cart, his head wrapped in cloth. She was then led to Tower Green, the more private execution site within the tower walls reserved for high-status prisoners, where a small crowd had gathered. She was approximately 16 or 17 years old. Her exact birth year is disputed, falling somewhere between 1536 and 1537. Accounts of her final moments describe her as composed, even dignified. She reportedly read from a small Greek New Testament as she walked to the scaffold and delivered a short speech acknowledging she had done wrong in accepting the crown, but insisting she had never consented to it of her own will. After being blindfolded, she struggled momentarily to find the block, a detail that makes the scene almost unbearably human, before laying her head down. She was buried without ceremony in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower, the same small chapel that holds Anne Boleyn. For centuries afterward, Jane was mythologized as a Protestant martyr and innocent victim, the bookish, pious girl destroyed by the ambitions of men. A narrative that still largely holds up because the historical record supports it. Mary I. Mary I came to the throne having already survived, more than most people experience in a lifetime, the humiliation of her parents' annulled marriage, the bastardization of her own legal status, years of isolation and political danger under her brother Edward's Protestant regency. And yet the cruelest thing history did to her was biological, not political. In September 1554, just months after her marriage to Philip II of Spain, Mary stopped menstruating. Her abdomen swelled. She experienced nausea and other symptoms that her physicians confidently interpreted as pregnancy. Across Europe, Catholic powers readied themselves for the news of a royal heir who would cement England's return to Rome. The months passed, no child came. By the summer of 1555, Mary's belly had subsided, the symptoms had disappeared, and it was silently acknowledged that there had been no baby. The most plausible modern explanations are grim. Historians have proposed ovarian cancer, uterine cancer, or a condition called pseudocysis, a documented psychosomatic phenomenon in which profound desire for pregnancy can produce genuine physical symptoms including cessation of menstruation, abdominal swelling, and morning sickness. A second phantom pregnancy followed in 1557, the cycle repeating with the same heartbreaking precision, the symptoms, the hope, the waiting, and then the slow, humiliating acknowledgement of nothing. Philip II, who had married Mary largely for political advantage and felt little personal warmth toward her, largely abandoned England after the second episode, returning to Spain and leaving Mary to govern alone. She burned approximately 283 Protestants at the stake during her reign, the actions that earned her the name Bloody Mary, though she understood herself as saving souls rather than destroying them. But by her final year, she was a diminished figure, ill, deserted, and politically weakened by England's loss of Calais to France in January 1558, the last English territory on French soil. She reportedly told her attendants that when she died, they would find the word Calais written on her heart. Whether or not she said exactly that, she died on November 17, 1558. At St. James's Palace, aged 42, almost certainly during a severe influenza epidemic that was sweeping England at the time. Though whether influenza, cancer, or a combination of both caused her death remains genuinely unresolved. Elizabeth I succeeded her the same day. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots, was not Queen of England, she was Queen of Scotland and, briefly, Queen Consort of France. But she was executed on English soil by order of an English queen, which earns her a place on this list, and which makes her death one of the most dramatic events in the entire history of the British monarchy. By February 8, 1587, Mary had been Elizabeth I's prisoner for 18 years, held in a succession of English castles and manor houses after fleeing Scotland in 1568, following a catastrophic sequence of events involving a murdered husband, a scandalous remarriage, and a forced abdication. Elizabeth had never wanted to execute her. Mary was a fellow queen and a cousin, and executing an anointed monarch set a precedent Elizabeth found deeply uncomfortable. But the Babington Plot of 1586, in which Mary was shown to have endorsed a plan for Elizabeth's assassination, left little political room for mercy. The execution took place at Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire, before a small invited audience of local dignitaries and officials. Mary dressed with deliberate intention. Beneath a black outer gown she wore crimson, the Catholic color of martyrdom, a statement visible to everyone in the room the moment her outer dress was removed. She was calm. Eyewitness accounts describe her assistants weeping, while Mary herself moved through the final preparations almost serenely. Then the execution began, and everything went wrong. The first blow of the axe missed her neck entirely, striking the back of her head. According to contemporary eyewitness accounts, she made a sound, described by some witnesses as a groan, before the second blow landed more accurately. Even then, the head was not severed, and a third strike was required to complete the decapitation. When the executioner reached down to lift her head by the hair and announce "God save the Queen," Mary's auburn hair came away in his hand. It was a wig. Her actual head with its close-cropped gray hair fell to the floor of the scaffold. Then, as attendants moved to prepare the body, something moved beneath her skirts. Her small dog, which had been hidden there and had remained beside her throughout the entire execution, pressed against her body under the heavy fabric. It refused to leave and had to be physically removed from the room. It was found later, crouched between her severed head and her shoulders, and reportedly would not eat afterward. She was 44 years old and had spent almost half her life as a prisoner. Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I built her public image on a face, and that face may have killed her. The iconic chalk-white complexion that defined her portraiture for 4 decades was achieved through a cosmetic paste called Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead carbonate and vinegar that was applied thickly, sometimes, according to contemporary accounts, up to an inch deep, to cover the scarring left by a near-fatal bout of smallpox she contracted in 1562. She survived the smallpox, but the ceruse became a permanent feature of her public appearance and, according to many historians, a slow-acting poison. Lead was absorbed through the skin with every application, and the symptoms Elizabeth exhibited in the years before her death are entirely consistent with chronic lead poisoning. Significant hair loss, which she concealed under a collection of wigs that grew more elaborate as she aged. Blackening and loss of teeth, skin damage, and memory disruption. Whether lead poisoning was the primary cause of her death or merely a contributing factor remains debated among historians. And it should be noted that Elizabeth was also 69 years old in 1603, an exceptionally advanced age for the 16th century. What is documented is the strangeness of her final days. In the weeks before her death, Elizabeth fell into a deep melancholy following the execution of her former favorite, the Earl of Essex, in 1601, and the deaths of several close friends and counselors. She stopped eating. She refused to go to bed, reportedly standing in her chambers at Richmond Palace for stretches of up to 15 hours at a time, unable or unwilling to lie down. According to accounts from her ladies-in-waiting, she feared that if she lay down she would never rise again. When her council attempted to move her to bed, she reportedly told them that the word must was not to be used to princes. She eventually became too weak to stand and was lowered onto cushions on the floor, where she remained as her condition deteriorated. Her rumored last words, "All my possessions for a moment of time," have passed into legend, though their precise sourcing is difficult to verify. She died on March 24, 1603, at Richmond Palace, ending a reign of 44 years, the Tudor dynasty, and an era of English history that has never quite been matched for its combination of political drama, cultural flowering, and sheer force of personality at the top. Mary II. Mary II is one of the least discussed English queens and one of the most quietly remarkable. A woman who accepted a constitution her father refused, shared power with a husband who was not always easy to share it with, and then died at 32 with an efficiency and dignity that characterized almost everything she did. She fell ill at Kensington Palace on December 19, 1694. Physicians initially suspected measles. Then the rash appeared on her arms, and the diagnosis shifted, but even then there was a moment of cautious hope, because not all smallpox was equally fatal. That hope dissolved when doctors examined the nature of the pustules more closely. In ordinary smallpox, the blisters rise, fill, and eventually burst. In Mary's case, the pustules were sinking into her flesh rather than rising from it, a presentation known as hemorrhagic smallpox, sometimes called black smallpox, a strain characterized by bleeding under the skin and into the mucous membranes, and a mortality rate that was effectively total. There was no recovery from hemorrhagic smallpox. It was a death sentence written in the skin. Mary understood this quickly. Her first response upon recognizing the seriousness of her condition was not self-pity but practicality. She immediately dismissed from her rooms everyone who had not already had smallpox, to prevent them from contracting it from her. She then began quietly setting her affairs in order, burning private papers she did not wish others to read. The irony of her illness was devastating for William III, her husband and co-ruler. His own father had died of smallpox, and he had spent years fearing the disease. Now he watched it take his wife. When Mary died on December 28, 1694, William collapsed at her bedside and had to be carried from the room, barely conscious with grief by his attendants. He would never remarry. Her death prompted a national outpouring of mourning unprecedented for the era. For the first time in English history, the coffin of a monarch was accompanied to its resting place by both Houses of Parliament, Lords and Commons together, walking in procession behind her body through the streets of London. She had reigned for 5 years. She was 32 years old. Queen Anne. Queen Anne's story is one of the most devastating in the history of the British monarchy, and it has nothing to do with politics or war or treachery. It has to do with pregnancy, 17 of them between 1684 and 1700, and the fact that not one of those pregnancies produced a child who lived beyond childhood. The exact count varies slightly depending on how different sources categorize early losses, but at minimum 17 pregnancies are documented. The majority ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Several produced infants who died within hours or days of birth, and one, her son William, Duke of Gloucester, survived long enough to become her greatest hope. William was a sickly child, but he reached 11 years old, which in Anne's world was almost miraculous. He died in July 1700, most likely from a fever, and with him died any realistic possibility of Anne producing a Protestant Stuart heir. Parliament had already been preparing for this outcome. The Act of Settlement of 1701 was passed specifically to ensure the Protestant succession would pass to the House of Hanover rather than to any of the Catholic Stuart claimants, meaning that when Anne died, the crown would go to a German prince, George of Hanover, whom Anne had never met and apparently had little enthusiasm for. Anne herself was physically destroyed by the accumulation of loss. 17 pregnancies had ravaged her body. She suffered from gout so severe that it was often impossible for her to walk. She was carried to her own coronation in a sedan chair in 1702, and in her later years she was almost entirely immobile, her joints swollen, and her body heavy with fluid retention. She is frequently described by historians as one of the most physically suffering monarchs in British history. Not from any single dramatic illness, but from the cumulative damage of reproductive trauma and gout compounding over decades. A persistent popular claim that her coffin was almost square in shape to accommodate her body has been repeated often enough to become legend, though its precise sourcing is unclear and should be treated with caution. What is clearly documented is her death on August 1, 1714, at Kensington Palace at the age of 49, following a series of strokes. She had outlived every single one of her children. With her died the Stuart dynasty, and the Britain that emerged from her death, a Hanoverian constitutionally governed Britain, was a different country from the one she had been born into. Queen Elizabeth II. Elizabeth II is the only queen on this list who died of nothing dramatic, and that itself is a kind of remarkable fact. She died on September 8, 2022, at Balmoral Castle in the Scottish Highlands, the estate she loved more than anywhere else, surrounded by family, at the age of 96, and her death certificate listed the cause as old age, a designation that is itself almost historically unusual in the context of British monarchy. She had reigned for 70 years and 214 days, longer than any other British monarch in history, longer than any other monarch currently living, and long enough that the majority of people alive on the planet in 2022 had never known a world without her. Her reign began in February 1952, when she was 25 years old, and Winston Churchill was her prime minister, and it ended in 2022 with Liz Truss, who had been appointed by Elizabeth just 2 days before her death on September 6, her 15th prime minister, bookending a reign that had spanned the entirety of the Cold War, the end of the British Empire, the invention of the internet, and almost every significant geopolitical shift of the modern era. Unlike every other woman on this list, Elizabeth II was not killed by a disease misunderstood by medicine, not executed, not destroyed by a king's demands, not broken by phantom pregnancies, or botched executions or lead-laced cosmetics. She was the beneficiary of modern medicine, modern nutrition, and a constitution that gave her enormous symbolic power while sparing her the lethal political exposure that destroyed so many of her predecessors. Her death triggered the most extensive state ceremonial Britain had mounted in living memory, a 10-day period of national mourning, queues stretching miles through central London as hundreds of thousands of people waited to file past her coffin lying in state in Westminster Hall, and a funeral estimated to have been watched by somewhere in the range of 4 billion people worldwide, making it arguably the most watched single event in human history. She was buried at Windsor Castle beside her husband Prince Philip, who had died in April 2021. She had been queen for so long and so consistently that the machinery of the state had almost forgotten how to function without her. The moment she died, 70 years of a particular kind of continuity ended, and everything that followed, the proclamation of a new king, the currency changing, the anthem changing, was a reminder of just how long she had been the fixed point around which British public life had rotated. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.